The Xindi should have ran when they had the chance. Countless worlds had fallen to the Galactic Xindi Empire, but they'd never tangled with humanity before. Captain Douglas Cox gripped the armrest of his command chair as the HSS Indomitable, the most advanced warship in the human fleet, hurtled through Xindi space. Cox was a battle-hardened veteran, his eyes steely and jaw-set. He'd seen more than his share of bloodshed, but nothing could have prepared him for the devastation that greeted the Indomitable at the remote human mining colony. The distress signal had come too late. The colony lay in ruins, the bodies of the defenders strewn across the blood-soaked ground. Amid the carnage, Cox found a lone survivor, a young man barely clinging to life. The miner grabbed Cox's arm with a shaking, blood-smeared hand. "The Xindi," he rasped, his breath rattling in his throat. "They're more powerful, more merciless than we ever imagined. You have to warn—" The man's words trailed off as the life faded from his eyes. Righteous fury surged through Cox's veins. These colonists, these innocent civilians, had been slaughtered like animals. He rose to his feet, his fists clenched at his sides. The Xindi would pay for this atrocity. He barked orders to his crew, his voice rough with barely contained rage. The Indomitable would hunt down the attackers to their base and exact vengeance. But even as the ship leaped into warp, Cox couldn't shake the sinking feeling in his gut. The dying miner's warning echoed in his mind. What if humanity had underestimated the Xindi? What if they were marching blindly into a war they couldn't win? Failure was not an option. The very survival of the human race hung in the balance. As the Indomitable raced toward the enemy's stronghold, Cox knew that the next few hours would decide the fate of humanity. He would fight to his last breath to defend his people, even against impossible odds. For if the Xindi were not stopped here and now, Earth itself would be their next target. The interrogation of Lyra, the captured Xindi base commander, yielded vital intelligence. She revealed the location of the Xindi homeworld and the existence of the heavily fortified Imperial Palace. Captain Douglas Cox knew that striking at the heart of the Empire was humanity's only chance for survival. Cox ordered a course set for Xindi space, pushing the Indomitable's engines to their limits. As the ship hurtled through the void, a coded transmission from Earth's military leaders crackled over the secure channel. They confirmed Cox's worst fears. The Xindi were preparing for a full-scale invasion of human territory. Earth was marshaling every available ship and soldier to mount a desperate defense, but they needed time. "Captain Cox," the gravelly voice of Admiral Graves echoed through the comm, "you must delay the Xindi advance by any means necessary. We're counting on you to buy us the time we need." Cox grimly acknowledged the orders, the weight of responsibility settling heavily on his shoulders. As the Indomitable ventured deeper into enemy territory, the resistance intensified. Xindi patrol ships swarmed like angry hornets, peppering the human warship with laser fire. Defense platforms unleashed volleys of missiles, forcing the Indomitable to weave and dodge through the deadly barrage. On the bridge, Cox gripped the arms of his command chair as the ship bucked and shuddered under the onslaught. Sparks cascaded from overloaded consoles, and the acrid stench of burnt circuitry filled the air. But the crew of the Indomitable fought back with unshakable focus, their advanced weaponry and superior tactics turning the tide against the numerically superior foe. In the midst of the chaotic battles, long-range sensors picked up a disturbing reading. A massive Xindi armada was gathering at the Khyber Pass, a strategic choke point on the route to human space. Cox instantly recognized the danger. If that fleet got through, it would spell doom for Earth and her colonies. The Indomitable's senior officers advised caution, urging Cox to wait for reinforcements. But the captain knew there was no time. He gave the order to set course for the Khyber Pass, his voice steady despite the desperate nature of their mission. As the lone human warship approached the massed Xindi fleet, Cox felt a flicker of fear in his gut. The odds were stacked against them, but he pushed the feeling aside. Failure was not an option. "All hands to battle stations," he commanded, his voice ringing out through the ship. "Prepare to engage the enemy." The Indomitable charged headlong towards the Xindi armada, weapons blazing. Railgun slugs tore through enemy hulls, missiles detonated in blinding flashes, and experimental singularity torpedoes ripped apart the fabric of space-time itself. The human ship took hit after hit, alarms blaring as systems failed and bulkheads collapsed. But still, they fought on, pouring fire into the Xindi ranks. Against the odds, the Indomitable managed to bottle up the enemy fleet in the narrow confines of the Khyber Pass. But Cox knew it was only a temporary reprieve. He had to strike a decisive blow. Gathering a hand-picked team of his best fighters, Cox personally led a boarding action against the Xindi flagship. They fought their way through the dreadnought's corridors, locked in close-quarters combat with the ship's defenders. Finally, they reached the bridge, where Cox confronted General Zoltar himself. The two warriors clashed in a desperate melee, evenly matched in skill and persistence. But as the Xindi fleet began to break through the Indomitable's blockade, Zoltar made a fateful decision. Rather than allow his ship to be captured, he activated the self-destruct sequence. Alarms blared and warning lights flashed as the dreadnought began to tear itself apart from within. Cox and his team barely managed to make it back to their shuttle, blasting free of the doomed warship moments before it exploded in a blinding flash. The detonation ripped through nearby Xindi vessels, disabling or destroying them in the process. Battered but unbroken, the Indomitable limped out of the Khyber Pass, leaving the shattered remnants of the Xindi armada behind. Cox sagged back in his command chair, exhausted but triumphant. They had bought Earth precious time, but at a heavy cost. Now, the Indomitable set course for the Xindi homeworld and the heavily guarded Imperial Palace. Cox knew that the fate of humanity rested on his shoulders. They had to find a way to breach those impregnable defenses and strike at the heart of the enemy. The war was not nearly finished. The Indomitable emerged from warp, its hull still scorched from the battle at Khyber Pass. The Xindi homeworld loomed before them, a fortress world overflowing with defenses. Cox stood on the bridge, his eyes fixed on the swarm of enemy ships and orbital platforms guarding their target. "All hands battle stations," Cox ordered. "Initiate Operation Thunderclap." The crew sprang into action. Engineers rerouted power to the deflector shields, pushing them beyond safe limits. The Indomitable surged forward, plunging into the heart of the Xindi defenses. "Shields at 200% capacity, sir," the tactical officer reported. "EMP pulse ready on your mark." Cox took a deep breath. Fire. A blinding wave of electromagnetic energy erupted from the Indomitable, washing over the nearby Xindi vessels. Their lights flickered and died as systems overloaded. "Now launch the probes." A salvo of sleek transporter probes shot from the Indomitable's launch tubes. Cox, Lieutenant Graves, and a team of battle-hardened Marines were beamed into the probes microseconds before impact. Xindi interceptors screamed towards them, energy weapons blazing. 2 probes exploded in fireballs, but the rest punched through the planetary defense grid. Cox materialized in a sterile white corridor. The stench of antiseptic filled his nostrils as he raised his pulse rifle. "Move out," he whispered. The team fought their way through squads of chitinous Xindi guards. Plasma bolts sizzled past them as they pushed deeper into the detention compound. They found the POWs huddled in cramped cells. Among them was a woman with sharp eyes and disheveled hair. "Dr. Veers?" Cox asked. She nodded. "Captain, we need to get to Vault 17. My research—" "Lead the way, Doctor." They battled through waves of reinforcements, Veers guiding them to a heavily fortified data vault. Cox planted breaching charges while Graves provided covering fire. The vault door blew inward. Cox snatched the data core containing Veers's research just as alarms blared. "Imperial Guard incoming! We're out of time!" They sprinted for the extraction point, pulse rifles spitting fire at pursuing Xindi. The Indomitable hovered above, its hull pockmarked with fresh damage. "Beam us up," Cox shouted into his comm. The transporter beam enveloped them just as a barrage of Xindi fire tore through their position. Back on the bridge, Cox took the helm. Engaging prototype cloak, Veers called out. The ship shimmered, becoming translucent. Cox gritted his teeth and pushed the engines to maximum. They streaked past disabled Xindi ships, aiming for the gleaming spire of the Imperial Palace. Solidifying in 3, 2, 1. The Indomitable crashed through the spire's outer hull in a shower of debris. Marines poured out of the breach, storming into the opulent throne room. The Xindi Emperor, a hulking insectoid creature, roared in fury. His royal guard opened fire, cutting down several humans. Lieutenant Graves took a hit to the chest, collapsing to the floor. "Graves!" Cox shouted. He fired a burst into the nearest guard, then leveled his weapon at the Emperor's head. "Order your fleets to stand down, now!" The Emperor's mandibles clicked in defiance. "I will crush you insects beneath my heel." Cox's finger tightened on the trigger. A lifetime of rage and loss boiled up inside him. One squeeze and humanity would be avenged. "Wait!" Veers cried out. "Captain, don't shoot. The Emperor's DNA. It's tied into their entire command structure. If he dies, it could trigger a dead man's switch. We'd never make it out alive." Cox's hand shook. He stared into the Emperor's compound eyes, seeing nothing but hate. "Then what do we do?" Veers stepped forward. "We need him to recall the invasion fleet. It's the only way to save Earth." The captain nodded grimly. He pressed the barrel of his rifle against the Emperor's carapace. "You heard the doctor. Call off your ships, or I'll find out just how much pain you can endure before I put you down." The Emperor's antennae twitched. Cox knew the stakes couldn't be higher. If the Xindi leader was lying, Earth's destruction would be on his hands. Hands. The Emperor's compound eyes glinted with malice as Cox pressed the rifle barrel against his chitinous exoskeleton. "Last chance," Cox growled. "Call off your fleet or I'll splatter your insides across this fancy throne room." Dr. Veers stepped forward, her voice urgent. "Captain, wait. If you kill him, it could trigger automated defenses. We'd never make it out alive." Cox's finger tightened on the trigger. "Then what do you suggest, Doctor? We can't let him continue this invasion." Veers pulled a compact device from her pack. "His DNA is linked to the Xindi command structure. If we can force him to transmit a recall order, it'll stop the invasion in its tracks." The Emperor chittered, mandibles clicking in defiance. "I will never submit to human filth." Cox lowered his weapon slightly, considering their options. With a curt nod, he motioned for Veers to proceed. She approached cautiously, attaching leads from her device to the Emperor's carapace. "Do it!" Cox ordered, keeping his rifle trained on the Xindi leader. The Emperor remained silent, eyes burning with hatred. Cox's patience wore thin. He grabbed Veers roughly, pressing his weapon to her head. "You want to see how much I value human life?" Cox snarled. "Give the order or I'll execute this scientist right here." Fear flickered across the Emperor's face. His antennae twitched nervously as he glanced between Cox and Veers. "You wouldn't dare," the Emperor hissed. Cox's finger tightened on the trigger. "Try me." Seconds stretched into an eternity. Finally, the Emperor slumped in defeat. "Very well. Release the human." Cox shoved Veers aside, keeping his weapon trained on the alien ruler. The doctor's fingers flew across her device, interfacing with the Emperor's neural pathways. A series of chittering sounds emanated from the Xindi leader as the recall order transmitted. Tense minutes passed. Then, reports began flooding in from across the sector. Xindi ships were standing down, retreating from human space. Cox allowed himself a moment of relief before the Indomitable's sensors blared a warning. "Captain," Lieutenant Santos called out, "we're detecting a massive energy spike in the Palace reactor core." Veers' eyes widened in horror. "It's a trap. He encoded a self-destruct sequence with the retreat order." Cox whirled on the Emperor, who chittered in cruel amusement. "You've doomed us all, human. My death will take half this world with it." "Not if I can help it," Cox growled. He turned to Veers. "Doctor, that cloaking device of yours, can it get us to the reactor core?" Veers nodded hesitantly. "Yes, but—" "No time to argue. You're with me." Cox tapped his comm. Indomitable, get clear of the blast radius. We're going in. Ignoring protests from his ship's commander, Cox gathered a small team. Veers activated her prototype phasing cloak, enveloping them in a shimmering field. They sprinted through the palace corridors, passing straight through walls and security barriers. They emerged in the cavernous reactor chamber just as the countdown neared 0. Cox's heart sank as he saw the sabotaged control panels. "We can't shut it down," Veers said, her voice tight with fear. Cox's mind raced. "Then we eject it. Can you buy us some time?" Veers nodded, fingers flying across her data pad. "I can upload a virus to temporarily halt the sequence, but it won't last long." As Veers worked, Cox outlined his desperate plan. They'd need to activate emergency venting protocols, ejecting the entire reactor into the planet's upper atmosphere. "I'll stay here and keep the virus running," Veers said. "You'll need to find the ejection override stations." Cox nodded grimly. He led his team through the labyrinthine complex, phasing through walls to avoid Xindi patrols. They located and primed each override, racing against time. "Virus is failing," Veers' voice crackled over the comm. 30 seconds to detonation." Cox sprinted back to the main chamber, slamming his hand down on the final override. The floor beneath them shuddered as massive hydraulics engaged. "Brace yourselves," Cox shouted. The reactor tore free from its moorings, rocketing skyward through the palace superstructure. Cox grabbed Veers, activating the phasing cloak once more. They passed through the outer hull just as the reactor breached the atmosphere. A blinding flash lit up the sky. The reactor's containment finally failed, but the vacuum of space consumed the blast before it could trigger a planet-wide cataclysm. Exhausted and battered, Cox and his team stumbled back to their extraction point. The Indomitables swooped in, scooping them up before Xindi reinforcements could arrive. As they limped away from the Xindi homeworld, Cox allowed himself a moment to breathe. They'd stopped the invasion and saved countless lives, but the furious Xindi Emperor, now locked in the brig, remained a deadly threat. Cox knew their work was just the beginning. Somehow, they'd need to... The Indomitables' engines thrummed as they pushed deeper into Xindi space. Captain Cox stood at the viewport, his face haggard from sleepless nights. The captive Xindi Emperor sat in the brig below, a constant reminder of their precarious situation. Alarms blared. Cox rushed to the bridge as Dr. Veers' voice crackled over the comm. "Captain, the Emperor's sending out another transmission." Cox burst onto the bridge. "What's he doing now?" Veers' fingers flew across her console. "It's encrypted, but I'm picking up Xindi military frequencies. He's rallying his forces." "Shut it down," Cox ordered. "Working on it," Veers replied, her brow furrowed in concentration. "There, signal blocked." Cox clenched his fist. "That's the third attempt this week. We need to end this." Days later, they docked at Starbase 12. The harsh lights of the medical bay cast deep shadows across Lieutenant Graves's face as Cox stood by his bedside. Graves's chest rose and fell weakly, tubes snaking from his body. "I'm sorry, sir," Graves whispered. "I won't be joining you on Kronos." Cox gripped his friend's hand. "You focus on getting better. We'll finish this." Under cover of night, Cox led a small team to a secluded hangar. They marched the Emperor, bound and gagged, up the ramp of a sleek Type 7 shuttle. The Xindi ruler's compound eyes glared with hatred. "If this goes sideways," Cox warned his team, "we're on our own." The shuttle slipped past Kronos' orbital defenses, cloaking technology masking their approach. They landed in a desolate region of twisted rock formations. Cox activated a holomap. "Calrac's compound is 5 clicks north. Move out." They trekked across the alien landscape, weapons at the ready. Strange, multi-limbed creatures scuttled in the shadows. A massive stone fortress loomed before them. Cox tapped his communicator. "This is Captain Cox of the Terran Alliance. We seek an audience with Warlord Calrac." Tense moments passed. Finally, the gates creaked open. Inside, they faced rows of heavily armed Xindi warriors. Warlord Calrac, a hulking insectoid creature, stepped forward. "Why have you come, human?" Cox shoved the Emperor forward. I bring you the architect of your people's suffering. Help us end this war, and the Cindy throne is yours. Calrac's mandibles clicked. You expect me to believe? Cox yanked off the Emperor's gag. The ruler snarled, Kill these vermin! I am your Emperor! Calrac's troops raised their weapons. Cox's team braced for a firefight. Wait! Calrac bellowed. He studied the captive ruler, then turned to Cox. What are your terms? Hours of negotiation followed. Cox demanded the withdrawal of Xindi forces from human space. Calrac insisted on maintaining a defensive posture. The debate grew heated. You have no concept of Xindi honor, Calrac roared, looming over Cox. Cox stood his ground. And you have no concept of human tenacity. Work with us, or we'll find someone who will. Finally, they reached an uneasy agreement. The next day, Cox broadcast a message across Xindi communication channels. People of the Xindi Empire, your Emperor's war against humanity has failed. He is dead. Lay down your arms and return to your homes. Over the following weeks, reports trickled in of Xindi fleets standing down, but on Kronos, the situation deteriorated rapidly. Calrac burst into their quarters. Humans! You've doomed us all! What are you talking about? Cox demanded. The Emperor must die by my hand, Calrac snarled. Only then will my claim to the throne be secure. Cox's team found themselves surrounded by Calrac's elite guard. They fought their way through winding corridors, dragging the Emperor with them. To the shuttle! Cox shouted as plasma bolts sizzled past. They sprinted across the landing pad, returning fire. Dr. Veers took a glancing hit to her shoulder but kept running. The shuttle's engines roared to life as they piled inside. Calrac's forces opened up with heavy weapons, rocking the small craft. We'll never make it past their fleet, Veers warned. A familiar voice crackled over the comm. This is Captain Castillo of the Indomitable. Need a lift, boys? The massive warship dropped out of warp, its weapons blazing. Under its cover, Cox's shuttle streaked for open space. Back aboard the Indomitable, Cox slumped in his chair. The immediate danger had passed, but the conflict was just the beginning. He thought of the genetic repositories that held the key to the Xindi's power and their vulnerability. Set course for the Procyon system, Cox ordered. The weight of what came next pressed down on him. Billions of lives hung in the balance, but to ensure humanity's survival, he'd have to become the very thing they'd been fighting against.
You have reached the end of the story. If you enjoyed this story and want to support us, please leave a like and subscribe to our channel, and for every comment that says 88, I will heart every single one of them. Thank you for your time.